On the 1st of April 1932, the Imperial Japanese Navy created the Naval Air Arsenal, which was based at Yokosuka. Under the direction of Rear Admiral Maebara, Vice Admiral Matsuyama, and Rear Admiral Yamamoto, the Naval Air Arsenal would transform the designs and production of Japanese aircraft, which would subsequently increase their theoretical impact on the battlefield. As far as the Navy was concerned, this increased the value of the aircraft carrier, as it would go from being a support ship to being a primary active unit. There was a massive issue with the aircraft carrier, though. While its output of damage could be extraordinarily high, it could also receive the exact same in return. The aircraft carrier was extraordinarily vulnerable. It was clear that the aircraft carrier would need to be supported by a series of other vessels, and the most obvious contender was the destroyer, since these were the fastest vessels in the Navy, and they could easily keep up with the carriers, but they did have some major drawbacks. Their operational range, on average, in the mid-1930s was anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 nautical miles, which was quite short for long-range operations, meaning that during operations, the aircraft carriers would have to stop and refuel their escort ships, which was not ideal. They also didn't have the heaviest anti-aircraft armament, and by the mid-1930s, their weapons, in many respects, were outdated, as they either had the old 12cm dual-purpose guns, or the relatively mediocre 12.7cm guns, plus a handful of 25mm machine guns, which were largely useless. In 1935, the Royal Navy converted 2 light cruisers into the so-called anti-aircraft ship, and so the Japanese decided to follow in suit, and they selected 2 Tenru-class light cruisers to be converted into anti-aircraft ships as well. Their main armament would be removed, and in their place would be 4 40-caliber Type 89 12.7cm high-angle guns with 150 rounds per barrel, and 2 Type 94 high-angle fire control systems in order to use these weapons effectively, and 4 25mm triple-mount machine guns with 3,000 bullets per barrel. The planned year for the conversion to begin was 1938, but cool minds prevailed, and this conversion never occurred. In April of 1937, a new anti-aircraft weapons design had been completed, and it was produced in 1938. This would become the Type 98 10cm dual-purpose gun. The creation of this weapon is most likely why the conversion of the 2 light cruisers never occurred, and on the 11th of July 1938, the Japanese Navy would call for a new design for an escort ship to specifically support aircraft carriers. Now, the qualities of this ship had to be extreme. The basic requirements were, it had to have an operational speed of 35 knots, it had to have an increased cruising speed when compared to other destroyers, it needed to mount the new 10cm Type 98 dual-purpose gun, it needed to be able to perform anti-submarine warfare, and it needed to have a long endurance, so this meant a large fuel load. Last but not least, since these ships were supposed to be in the thick of the battle, they were largely expendable units, so they needed to be relatively small and cheap to produce in large numbers. The Naval General Staff was looking for a ship that was roughly 2,200 tons standard displacement, with a top speed of 35 knots, and an operational range of 10,000 nautical miles at 18 knots, while it was also supposed to mount 4 dual 10cm guns. When the Naval Technical Department plugged all of the specifications into a design, they ended up creating a design of roughly 4,000 tons standard displacement and roughly 4,500 tons trial displacement. This design, that's supposed to be small and cheap, was roughly 2.5 times larger than the average Japanese destroyer, and they were approaching the standard light cruiser. In order to reach an operational range of 10,000 nautical miles, the ship also had to carry 1,200 tons of fuel base, and as this fuel was consumed, the ship's lower compartments would lighten, creating a situation where the ship became top-heavy, and the risk of capsizing increased, similar to what happened to the Tomozuru in 1934, and the Japanese Navy did not want to repeat that again. Another issue regarding stability that the Naval Technical Department found was that the most effective arrangement for the main armament was to be in 2 superfiring pairs, one forward and one aft. However, superfiring pairs increased the center of gravity, and this meant that the ships were top-heavy. Since the ship's primary role was to be an anti-aircraft support ship, the requirements surrounding these weapons could not be altered, and the Naval Technical Department would have to create a design that incorporated this superfiring arrangement, but also created a stable ship. Another issue surrounding these ships was the top speed of 35 knots, as for the size of the ship being proposed, there was no propulsion system that would fit within it that could propel the ship at 35 knots at the time. So to add on to the problems that the design already had, the Japanese also needed to design an entire new propulsion system, which luckily this process was already underway, as the Japanese were working on an experimental destroyer design with a new propulsion system, and this would eventually become the Shimakaze. Since a displacement of 4,000 tons standard was unacceptable, the Naval General Staff chopped down their requirements, so the top speed was now 33 knots, and the operational range was 8,000 nautical miles, and at this stage, no torpedoes were to be mounted on this ship, as its primary role was to defend the aircraft carrier. After the requirements had been reduced, the Japanese were using their destroyer fleet in a series of war games. This incorporated destroyers predating Fubuki and following Fubuki. And the Japanese found that the destroyers predating the Fubuki had a difficult time positioning themselves to launch torpedoes, and they were largely useless in a torpedo line. Another thing the Japanese Navy realized at this time regarding the new anti-aircraft ships is that they had to play around with their finances in order to fund their construction, and this meant that the destroyer count for the 4th Naval Armament Program was reduced in order to produce these anti-aircraft ships, and so it made sense to mount torpedoes on them so that they could have a multifunction role, and the Japanese Navy did not lose effect as far as the torpedo boat department was concerned. So the Naval General Staff also required that a single quadruple mount for 61cm torpedoes be incorporated in the design, giving the ship more flexibility as far as its operational role was concerned, and the anti-aircraft ship would now be classified as a destroyer. This design was completed and presented to the Naval General Staff in September of 1938 with a standard displacement of 2,350 tons. After this design was submitted, it would be refined, the anti-submarine equipment would be altered, and its stability would be slightly reworked, and so in April of 1939, the final design was submitted with a standard displacement of 2,700 tons. The finalized statistics had 8 10cm dual-purpose guns and 4 dual mounts and 2 superfiring pairs, 1 forward, 1 aft, a single quad-mount torpedo launcher with 1 reload per tube, a top speed of 33 knots, and an operational range of 8,000 nautical miles at 18 knots. The same 52,000 shaft horsepower high-pressure turbine used on the experimental Shimakaze would also be used on the new class. Powering the turbine was 3 water tube camp-on boilers in 3 separate boiler rooms, and the funnel uptakes were reworked to combine into a single funnel, which was a unique feature for this class. The bridge superstructure's design was also reworked so that the bridge personnel could see over the top of the superfiring turrets. The ships had a construction price of 12,090,000 yen per unit, and the Naval General Staff found this suitable, so the design was accepted for construction, and the first ship, hull number 104, was laid down at the Maizuru Navy Yard on the 30th of July, 1940. It was launched on the 2nd of July, 1941, and commissioned on the 11th of June, 1942, as the IJN Akizuki. Since these ships were being produced during the Second World War, various changes would be made in order to simplify the design and speed up the production of these vessels so that more of them could be thrown into service, and this resulted in 2 subclasses being created. The ships constructed based off the original design, so the Akizuki type, were under the F-51 design. F-52 was the experimental destroyer Shimakaze, and so we move on to F-53, which is the Fuyuzuki type. Now, as far as the Japanese Navy was concerned, F-51 and 53 were the only official designs regarding this class, so officially there was only one subclass to this design. And the changes were the bow shape would be straightened, the stern shape would be straightened, and the aftermost Type 94 fire control director would be removed, and in its place would be a single triple 25mm machine gun mount. Now, the decision to straighten out the shape of the hull makes sense, This did simplify construction and sped it up by several months. However, the decision to remove the Type 94 Fire Control Director from its aft position does not make sense, and there's no explanation given for this. This without a doubt deteriorated the ship's ability to perform its anti-aircraft role, as now a single Type 94 director had to direct all 4 main battery turrets, rather than having one pair directed by one director. And the next design change, which resulted in the unofficial second subclass to the Akizuki type, was the Michizuki type, where the bow design was reworked, so rather than having a straight stem, it would now be in the V shape, similar to the medium-type aircraft carrier. The assumption behind this alteration was to increase the hydrodynamic flow of water. These destroyers were overall well designed, even though they were of excessive size compared to other destroyers of the time period, but this did give them the benefit of being more resistant to taking damage, as there were several occasions where these destroyers were torpedoed, struck mines, or were hit by bombs, and they managed to return to port under their own power. But most importantly, they enter the stage to protect the Shokaku and Zuikaku when they needed it most. With that having been said, there is nothing more to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.